I'd love to do is I'd love to read my favorite section, which is about something called murmurations. And I'm actually going to start by actually sharing my screen and showing you what a murmuration is. It's a flocking mechanism by a group of birds. And this is where that degree in dance became very, very useful throughout my life. I actually learned about the murmuration as a modern improvisational dancer in college, which sounds like, you know, your mother would be really worried about how you're going to pay your bills when you grow up, but actually has become a founding principle of how I move through the world, how I work in leaderful structures, in workplaces, in activism, in trainings. And here, I'm going to show you this video. And I don't know if you'll be able to hear the sound. The sound is pretty cool, but I'll talk over it. So here we're looking at tens of thousands of starlings swarming in this beautiful formation. And what they're doing is not just flying around randomly. They are actually driving a hawk away from their nests and their eggs. So this is a defensive maneuver. It's also a nonviolent action because they're not seeking to tear the hawk apart. With that many birds, they could undoubtedly do so. But they're just trying to say, you cannot be in this space. We are not going to allow you to attack us. What guides the murmuration is 4 principles. And these are the principles that I learned as a modern dancer. And they are that they're flying forward because birds don't fly backwards. They're staying equidistant, relatively spread out in an even pattern. They don't leave their wingmate out on the limb. So if one bird takes off, other birds go with it. So they find their strength in numbers. And whoever is in front of the swarm becomes the new leader, determining the direction that the swarm will fly. As you can see, it's a really versatile structure. It's really beautiful, fluid, organic, powerful in the sense that it can drive away that hawk. And it became a sort of inspiration for me as an activist and for the Dandelion Insurrection series. So I hope you enjoyed that video. I could sit there and watch those all day.
Oh, yeah.
And
sure.
so what I'd love to do is just read you a short section in which the murmuration comes to life in a group action in San Francisco, where hundreds of people are actually doing a street demonstration to demand that the wealthy return the community resources of their wealth to a community-controlled community fund, right? So not just charity determined by the whims of the wealthy, but rather a democratically controlled fund that responds to the needs determined by the people. So here's a description of how they take action. On the ground, the people turn slowly, following the motions of the nearest person to them as they stood in the heart of the giant murmuration. Zadie had never seen something so beautiful. Elegant, masterful, peaceful, strong. Here, a sense of calm settled like sunlight. The bustle of the city flew away. The people lifted their arms and rotated like a field of sunflowers. They stepped forward in the rhythm of antelope herds. They stilled like watchful birds, then darted into motion, swooping and diving. The mass of people rippled and contracted, shifting direction from moment to moment. They flooded the streets. They drifted onto the sidewalk. They charged along crosswalks. At the outermost rims, murmuration monitors in orange vests halted traffic. They also handed out flyers that explained how the murmuration was a reminder, a dance of respect for all living beings, a way of invoking the ecosystems of the world in the heart of a financial district whose decisions affected the entire planet. They moved like rivers curving and churning. They rippled like shoals of fish and mimicked the swooping wings of manta rays. They banked and turned in avian spirals. All of life swept through them. The patterning of clouds, amassing, swelling, breaking open into rain. The upward curls of unfurling ferns. The loping gambol of the wolf pack. The thundering gait of bison herds. The leaping flight of deer and dolphins. The slow sunning of turtles on logs. The earth thinks in circles. She dreams in spirals and nautilus shell revolutions. She paints in sprays of wildflowers, clusters of lichens, stands of trees. She moves in tidal dances forward and back in stretches of time too long for human conception. She tells her stories across eons. Her epics are epics, and humanity is not excused from her dance.
Yeah, beautiful. Thank you. It's a good segue for my first question. I have a bunch of questions. I might just pop around to all of them because there's so much in there. So this is something that people don't see every day. Never mind the birds. The pigeons. We have quite a few pigeons. You see them doing it right around the city. But let's say downtown San Francisco or Chicago or Toronto. It's going to be unusual. It's going to be uncomfortable. And this is I don't know if you say it so much in the book, but it's getting comfortable with being uncomfortable, new ways of doing things, right? Deconstructing, like this leaderful democracy, the way you speak about it, it makes so much sense. But we are, as a species, in this system right now. I just would like to hear your thoughts about how to, I guess it's about making change. How do you convince, coax, prove to people that being uncomfortable is okay?
Yeah, it's a tricky dance for sure. I think we live in times of great change where it's necessitated. We know that we're either going to upheave the whole way we do life, or we're not going to get much longer as a species on this planet. So getting comfortable with change is the name of the game for these times. And people are a whole range of comfortable with change. Some people love it. They can't wait to shake things up. Other people would like everything to stay exactly the same, particularly if they've been benefiting from the way the system is, right? So part of change is about opening the space for those folks to see themselves in a new world. But the bulk of change is about people themselves saying, continuing with the oppression, the injustice, and the suffering is no longer as easy as changing. And we're going to choose to make that change, right? And we're not going to beg for someone else to wave their magic wand to make this happen. We ourselves are going to initiate a transformational process. We're going to withdraw our cooperation and consent from the power structures. We are going to shut down city council meetings if they don't start talking about the climate crisis. We are going to blockade the highways if people do not want to acknowledge that racism is real. We're going to lock down to the construction equipment that's violating treaty rights, right? In this way, people are again and again saying that it is worth it to stand up for change because the other alternative leads to disaster, death, and continued oppression.
Do you think this is we're at a tipping point? Because it's not a new story, right? There's been instances in the past where change has occurred, sit-ins in the 60s, Vietnam, et cetera, like waves. But what's different about today than the past?
Yeah, a couple things. And, in a way, this is really what the Dandelion trilogy is sort of built on, is the growing understanding that nonviolent action is not unusual for humanity. The oldest recorded strike was in 1170 BC when Egyptian pyramid builders went on strike because the pharaoh wouldn't pay them their bread wages. But what we have seen in the last 100 years is a rapid escalation of people using the tools of nonviolent struggle. And just recently in 2012, I believe, 2011, a study came out showing that nonviolent tools are twice as successful as violent tools for things like changing governmental regimes, ending occupations, and expelling foreign invaders. So pretty major struggles are succeeding. We know that in the last 30 years, there have been 50 nonviolent revolutions. So what we're really seeing in the world is the emergence, and I think the internet has really facilitated people hearing these stories and learning how these tools work, and getting beyond just Gandhi and King and recognizing that people whose names we don't know and will never know have been incredibly successful at doing really challenging things against great odds. So the Dandelion Insurrection really seeks to lift up some of those tools and tactics to honor the kinds of stories that I'm hearing in the world, to uplift a new kind of hero and heroine, and maybe somebody who defines gender completely differently, and to really make sure that we recognize that activists are the heroes of this century and the century that's unfolding right now. Without them, we would be in a far more dire situation, which sounds horrible to say because we're in some dire situations, but every positive change that we see in the world is because ordinary people stood up for it, in my opinion. Maybe maybe there's one or two that would be an exception, but.
And ordinary, as it were. A lot of this book is informed by your lived experiences and your research, I assume. And can you talk a bit about anything that you learned even while writing it? Or, I mean, and the timing of it is remarkable, like you write about that in the introduction. It's like, maybe that it's meant to be. I mean, I can't see how it's not. I don't know anybody else who could have written this book other than you. So.
Well, everybody would write their own book, their own take, and we all take our lenses into seeing the nature of the world and reality and how change happens. And I certainly have my own, coming from my own background. But I would say I have learned a lot in the process. And in fact, I was an activist before I started writing the Dandelion Insurrection, but I was a pretty ignorant activist, honestly. I would go to protests and I would hold my signs, and I didn't really know what to do beyond that. But when I posited this hidden corporate dictatorship and this movement rising up to stop it, I got to this writing point and I was like, well, I can describe the problem really well, but I'm not really sure how to get them out of this mess. So I literally Googled it, how to bring down dictators nonviolently. And I thought maybe Ursula Le Guin would have written some sci-fi about this. But actually what came back was this incredible 4 million hits of how people have been using nonviolent action around the world, getting rid of dictators and bringing down tyranny and winning women's rights and fighting for racial justice and stopping pipelines and nuclear power plants and all sorts of stuff. And so it was in that kind of research, and I literally had a stack of books as tall as I am that I sat down and read my way through as I was revising the book, trying to incorporate some of the strategy of the movements. Because in the places that you will see nonviolent action happening in literature, speculative fiction, science fiction, fantasy, a lot of it repeats some of the tropes about nonviolent struggle, which include things like that it's weak, that it's passive, that it doesn't work, that people just get killed. In fact, that's one of the worst tropes that's repeated, is that, people are out there with their signs and they all just get gunned down, which certainly we have seen massacres in the course of nonviolent action, but they are actually far and few between compared to the other options of doing nothing, which usually involves an ongoing destruction of life, or using violent struggle, which has 10 times the casualties. This is an actual statistic, 10 times the casualties as nonviolent struggle. So what we find in the data is that the truth about nonviolent action actually belies all of the myths. It's not weak, it's not passive, it doesn't take too long. That's the other one you hear. It actually works in about a third of the amount of time as violent means, and that our casualty rates are a lot lower, even though people do get hurt. And I don't want to minimize the pain of that happening.
Mm-hmm. CV's got her hand raised. We'll go to her for a question. But I just want to say, like, what does it take to the courage that it takes for people to step forward? Like, the numbers itself, I don't think we're quite there yet with nonviolent versus violent on the planet, but I don't know how that's going to change. More examples?
Yeah, actually, far more people are engaged in nonviolent action than violence at present. It's pretty extraordinary. We have to remember there's over 300 different methods of nonviolent struggle, ranging from, holding that sign to civil disobedience to shutdowns, blockades, boycotts, occupations, puppets, juggling, mock funerals, real funerals, covert actions, refusals to comply, work slowdowns, walkouts, strikes. I think I said boycotts, but the list actually goes on. So that's the kind of hopeful news, that people are engaged in this. And when we say, are we at the tipping point? I think we need to break down the many goals that the movements have today and say, where are we achieving victories? And where is there work left to do? Because when we say, look, the world's a mess, and we say, is there a movement taking care of it? That's not the way movements really work. We see many movements rising up to take care of this piece and this piece and this piece. And we are making headway in many ways, and there's a lot left to do. Not to generalize too much, but I think there's reason for hope. And the biggest and most pressing concern that I see looming over us is that we do have a really stark and non-negotiable deadline along the climate crisis, which is very much entwined in many of our other historic and ongoing oppressions, including colonization, capitalism, racism, both colonization and racism fueling capitalism. I could go on, there's a few more.
Yeah.
And I wouldn't say my novels systematically go through and solve all the world's problems, but we do try to create a picture in which we see people choosing to take action and achieving certain victories.
Yeah, possibilities, showing the possibilities, right? Alternate models and solutions and discussions. Speaking of discussion, we will go, there's going to be a ton of questions. I have more, but we'll open it up to the group. Just CV had her hand up for a while. Can you want to unmute CV and ask your question?
Yes. So it's more of a process observation. I am profoundly entertained and intrigued by this idea, Rivera, that you Googled how to bring down a dictatorship and then pursued that line of study and the big thing of books. And I think that would be just a marvelous piece to talk about as an author, because I think folks are fascinated by the behind the scenes process of an author. But also it surprises me because I just assumed you knew all that stuff. Like I assumed that you were like this wise, nonviolent activist this whole time, and it was just coming out. And so I love this idea that you had this foundation of your own experience and this foundation of wisdom in your network, and still there was more to learn. I just am so encouraged by that somehow. I don't know, but I love the idea, and the idea of you sitting in your office Googling how to bring down a dictatorship. It's like, oh my God, it's that easy, people. It's that easy. right? You did it to write the book, but we could do it to figure out what actions we might want to try next.
Yeah, never. My lesson was never assume the answer's not out there. I was pretty overwhelmed. I think the thing that really hooked me was I learned that I was more powerful than I thought. I really started to understand where power lies. And it's a pretty heady experience to understand that power comes because we cooperate with it, either for better or for worse. And if we refuse our consent collectively and en masse, our cooperation to the injustices that we see, they simply cannot continue. They literally collapse. We see that with dictatorships, and we see that with workplaces where the workers go on strike. And it's really a question of organizing and express and the will of the people to use these tools.
Okay, so Rivera, I'm going to ask two distinct questions, but the first one is probably a it's a trodden down question when we talk about democracy, right? So what prevents, who gets to decide who the people are, and what if the people doing the murmurating are people who want to maintain the oppression and use the same tools in nonviolent struggle against folks who are trying to make a different type of change? So how do we, in democracy, it's like, well, first past the post, or 51%. But what if it's the wrong 51%, depending on your perspective? And my second thing is really related around the incredible increasing celebration of activists, to the point where I think we focused on the fact where someone is now running a activist form of Dragon's Den to have activists pitch for support for their cause. And I've seen other interesting types of incubators and accelerators around that. And even Sarah Kaplan's book, 360 Corporation, talks about how corporations need to start inviting activists to the table and not see them as adversaries, but engage with them. And she uses all these examples. So, hey, if the 90s was Silicon Valley and entrepreneurs, is 2010 the decade of activists? And how does that change how this work happens?
Yeah, I'll start with the last first and go back to the first. So yeah, I do see that. I know what you talk about with like the activists. One of the things there's a couple things to watch out for. One is misrepresentations of what activism is all about. It's not about certainly gaining support is part of activism, but it's not just a popularity contest, and it's not about building popularity to then go beg and petition a power holder to do the right thing. Certainly we see that kind of activism all the time, and indeed US representative republic is supposedly operates that way as a political system. But in truth, what I see is that change happens when people refuse to consent and cooperate and actually literally withdraw some kind of tangible support from the power holder, oppressor, or injustice. So making sure that as activism gains in popularity, we make sure that the real dynamics of power and struggle are being represented well in those presentations. And then the other part of it is watching out for being co-opted, right? So the activist job is not necessarily to stand in the center of society, but rather to challenge and confront the injustices that do occupy positions of power in our society. So making sure that we, if we are choosing to occupy a seat in, say, a corporate boardroom, that we understand the risks of that position, and that we're always willing to do what's right, even to the point of getting thrown out of that room, right? It's always been a tension about, do you change from the inside or do you push from the outside? And I think there's not an easy answer to that. I think we see both, and we often see both tensions working together. I personally am more of a push from the outside gal. Yeah, so as for the next question about democracy, and even the use of nonviolent action by groups whose views or vision for the world are things that we would find abhorrent. First of all, nonviolent action is a set of tools like a hammer or a pen, and anyone can pick those up. There is an argument that says that maybe we'd rather have them picking up a boycott than a bomb, for example. But then there is also this interesting dynamic that because nonviolent action actually builds upon people not just showing and expressing support, but engaging in those acts of removing cooperation. I still maintain that we do see people standing up more on the side of justice. It's a little bit of an unknown right now as nonviolent action popularizes. We are seeing right-wing groups use it. We are not seeing them use it at the same success rate as, I don't even want to say left-wing, but those advancing social justice goals that probably most people in this group would agree with. So it's complicated. As for democracy, that's almost another discussion. It does take a kind of crazy trust to believe in democracy. One of the things that helps me have a little bit of interest in real democracy is to look at the systems that we have now and say, are the political elites actually any better than that equation? Right? And there are a number of issues in which they are not. And I can't put my faith in them to make better and wiser decisions. The other thing about democracy, and this is something we do talk about a lot in Winds of Change, is to really go beyond even the concept of just 51% majority votes, and to really dig into what are the issues that get on the table, how do they get to the table, how do people find out about them, whose voices are being heard in the concerns and the possibilities being proposed around an item up for discussion, who's being brought into the decision making and the problem solving process. So to think of democracy as more than a vote and more of a robust process that involves the community and engages human beings' natural capacity to actually want to solve their problems together. Sounds crazy right now because we're so divided, but we do have a pretty innate kind of sense of wanting to solve problems together.
Terrific. So thank you so much, Rivera, for sharing your time and your grounded and beautiful wisdom.
Yes, as always. Thank you. Thank you everyone for coming tonight. I hope that was enjoyable. We'll see you next time in November, and we'll see you in the FAC.